the blockchain experience. Bringing dope content to the audience. Welcome to the blockchain experience. Bringing dope content to the audience. It's the blockchain spell made of David's got so much to tell.
Hello, GM, and welcome to another episode of the Blockchain Experience. I'm your host, MetaDavid. Our guest today is Ben Jones, one of the co-founders of Optimism, the layer 2 superchain that you surely have heard about at this point. This season is really off to a great start because just like my conversation with Roofstock in the last episode, I really enjoyed this one with Ben. Ben is not only extremely fun and charismatic, but we had a really good conversation about the future of L2s and Optimism's role in that, and I think it's going to be a huge one. There are many big organizations using Optimism Superchain. Base, Zora, and Collabland are some of the ones that come to mind, and there's countless other ones that are using OP mainnet. And yes, as always, we talk about people's tribalism around chains, and when we talk about the future and widespread blockchain usage, is the choice of the chain going to really matter? So we talk about those things on this episode. So great conversation. Hopefully you guys enjoyed. And once we do that, I'll give you guys a quick update on Scoop 3. So let's get to Ben Jones from Optimism. Ben from Optimism, welcome to the podcast. How are you, sir?
Hello. Thanks for having me on. I'm doing excellent. How about yourself?
I'm doing fantastic now that you're here. So happy to have you. So I wanted to bring Optimism on for a while now onto the podcast, and I'm happy we finally made it happen. I've known about Optimism. In fact, I'm on mirror.xyz, the Web3 newsletter platform, which is powered by Optimism. So I'm not just, someone who knows a bit about it, but I'm actually like a participant as well. But admittedly, one thing I wasn't aware of until On-Chain Summer by Base is that you guys are more than just like an L2. You aim to be a super chain. And I said this a couple years ago that I think this tribalism around blockchains is more of like a today thing. Realistically, especially if blockchain is playing a role in our day-to-day lives, my crystal ball doesn't see people at like a Thanksgiving dinner in 2035 arguing about which blockchain is better. So I think at the end of the day, what blockchain needs to do is just fulfill functions and get tasks done. When we power our devices, we don't look at whether it's like AC power or DC and what the voltage is and what the polarity is. I just need the thing to charge my device. So when you guys say super chain, you guys are probably thinking along the lines of the same thing, which is that a chain is functional, it's utilitarian, it gets things done. That's what the focus should be. So anyways, those are my thoughts. Maybe you disagree, but we'll get into that in a little bit, but just wanted to tee it up as to why I wanted to have you guys on. But before we get too deep into a conversation on that, Ben, why don't you introduce yourself and what you do at Optimism?
Cool. Sounds good. Thanks. And look, man, I'm sure we'll get into some nuance, but you're speaking the good speak. I'm liking the words coming out already. Cool. Yeah. I'm Ben again. Thanks for having me on, David. I'm one of the co-founders of Optimism. Right now I'm the chief scientist at the Optimism Foundation. I've worn a number of hats over the years. But ultimately we're here to scale blockchains, fund public goods, and make the internet a better place.
Let's go back to what I talked about earlier, which is what is Optimism's vision and growth of its ecosystem? Was like my long rant along the lines of your guys' vision.
Totally. I was picking up what you were putting down there for sure. Right. Like ultimately, I think the way that we say, kind of the words that we use to describe very similar things is that a lot of the details of blockchains have to become invisible to the users for blockchain to achieve its true potential and to reach global scale, right? There are incredibly important protocols that make up the internet, and we can totally have an extremely strong conviction that chains and ledgers are the next iteration of those critical protocols. At the same time, the way that those protocols found success was by fading into the background, right? You don't think about the IP address of the website that you're going to. You don't think about the server that the website you're going to is running on. You just think about the website. You just think about the application. And it should be the same in the future for the decentralized block space that will form the new substrate for the new internet that we're building, right? So ultimately what that means is exactly what you said. Yes, there will be these chain things. There will have to be lots of these chain things if we're, sufficiently bullish on the technology's adoption. But at the end of the day, if we're sufficiently bullish on the technology's adoption, that means that people are not thinking about the technology. It just means that they're getting utility. And that's how we, find our path to global adoption.
Yeah, and I find it's interesting you bring that up because I'm old enough where I find a lot of parallels between 90s internet adoption and what's going on right now. Because back then it wasn't just a matter of, connecting to the internet. There was a whole bunch of nuance involved in terms of like making sure that you have the right type of connection. I think it had to be like a PPP connection for it to support web. And there was just a whole bunch of different things. And it was very technical. And getting on the internet wasn't a simple thing. It became a little bit easier with AOL. And I remember even them, like their first implementation, I think like the internet was kind of just more like an add-on, but it was more like their internal ecosystem. So anyways, I can go on a lot about, the 90s and
I vibe with that hard, right? It's like there was an era of the internet where your family couldn't be on the phone, or that was going to cut off your internet access, right?
Oh yeah,
I can't think of a more compelling analogy to like bridging in the state of blockchain ecosystems today, where you're trying to move the assets from one chain to another using some crazy concoction that you're thinking about, right? It should all disappear, right? 100%. And I totally agree. There are a lot of parallels to early internet there.
Yeah, and that's how it is right now. Like when we use the internet, we don't really think twice about it. We're going and booking Airbnbs. We're going and buying things on Amazon. Our phones are connected. If you ask me what technology is connecting my phone to the internet, I don't really know, man. And I'm someone who used to work for Samsung for 10 years. But if you ask me to get into the nuance of like exactly how it's connected, I can't. I don't know. There might have been an era where the early adopters could speak to that, but that's just outside of my purview. So I hear that. So what's Optimism's value proposition on enhancing decentralized applications usability within the ecosystem? Because we're talking a lot about exactly that. What's your guys' value proposition? Because there's other L2s out there that are kind of trying to do the same thing. What sets you guys kind of like uniquely apart about that?
Yeah, I can definitely talk about some of the core values that we focus on, I think are super critical. So obviously the basics, like you said, are fundamentally scaling the technology and bringing it to the masses, right? What that means is that it needs to be way cheaper and have way higher throughput. It is unacceptable today to reach the levels of adoption that we're talking about, even if you could make just Ethereum itself disappear and people use applications without realizing that they're on Ethereum. The nature of that just being on Ethereum, and especially the layer 1 Ethereum chain, by definition will preclude the world from being able to use it, because Ethereum only has so much space. And as that space gets filled up, the prices have to increase in reaction to that. So ultimately, that's, of course, the core of what we're doing is bringing the scalable EVM block space to the masses in such a way that congestion doesn't kick in and price everybody out. So it's cheap, decentralized block space. That's ultimately the core of what we are doing. In terms of the layers on top, no pun intended, that you build, right? And another important nuance there is because we are a quote unquote layer 2, right? What that means is that you inherit the security from Ethereum. So the goal is to make that block space much more expansive and be able to meet the growing demand without sacrificing on the security. Or, for example, dividing the security that we have on Ethereum into a bunch of smaller chains that are all less secure, like you're dividing it up, right? So the goal is to preserve that security and all of that stuff. Beyond that, the other goal is to unify those ecosystems so that moving between those environments is seamless, right? This is exactly what we were just talking about with the superchain, right? It's not enough to just say we have a bunch of these chains if they're in isolation and they can't talk to each other. And that would be the same as if you had to redo your Wi-Fi connection for every website that you go to, right? That's like pretty much the state of the affairs that we have in crypto today. And it's understandable, like we said, early adoption and so on and so forth. But it is critical that we push those barriers down and make the seamless experience that we can all expect. The last thing that Optimism does is that we fund the public goods that create it. So from the origin story, even before it was called Optimism, our group of founders were working on basically a nonprofit called Plasma Group, where we were releasing open source specifications for how to do scalable blockchains. And what we realized along the way was that there were no mechanisms in place to reward and incentivize the people that are going to bring this technology into reality and build the critical public goods that are missing, and have that be connected to the value that is created by those people and the value that is resulting from that block space. So the last thing that Optimism is a public goods funding mechanism. We take the proceeds from the fees that are on the chains and we redistribute that to the people that are building the technology that makes the fees lower, that make the block space faster, make the UX better, so on and so forth. So yeah, maybe in a bit, that's what we are. We're a scalability, seamlessness, and funding the public goods that will make this journey over the next literal decade, multiple decades, continue to grow and prosper and not stagnate.
So I think Base is one of the better known examples of chains that are built on Optimism. Can you rattle off maybe a few other ones that people are perhaps familiar with, but maybe just don't know that they're built on top of Optimism?
Absolutely. Huge shout outs to Zora Network. Zora is a content platform. You can kind of think of it as NFTs, but I think they would say, tisk, Ben, Zora is not just NFTs, it's content, which I agree is a lot more powerful. So Zora Network is a really big one. Shout out to the Zora team. Shout out to the Mode Network that just launched as well. That's a really exciting one. Lyra was actually an app that started out on OP Mainnet, the original chain that we built out, and now has graduated into their own chain. I could go on, but there's a few more.
One thing I've noticed is that there is an Optimism token, and then there's like an Optimism, I don't know if I'm using the right word, but it's like blockchain or cryptocurrency, which is, Ethereum, basically, like the Ethereum layer 2. Can you talk a little bit about the Optimism token?
Yeah, I think that's a subset of the broader thing that is our real focus, which is the Optimism system of governance. And the token house is actually one half of that governance system. So when we launched our governance, coming up on 2 years ago now, we wanted to do something that was better. I talked about the notion of public goods funding. There are other problems in blockchain governance as well, right? Ultimately, tokens are an extremely useful mechanism, but they are fundamentally plutocratic in nature, right? It is fundamentally the case that there are different people who hold different amounts of this governance token and therefore have a disproportionate say in the governance of the system. For some use cases, that is great. In other cases, that is not what we want. So when we launched Optimism Governance, we made it a very explicit goal to go beyond that and push the limits. So Optimism Governance is a two-house system. There's the token house, which is the OP token that you mentioned. There's also the citizen house. The token house is one person, one token, one vote. The citizen's house is one person, one vote. Together, those two entities form the Optimism Collective, the Optimism Governance System, and both of them play a role in doing different components of the governance of the Optimism superchain, Optimism ecosystem.
So when it comes to the grants part, is that something that is determined by the governance system that you just described?
Yes, 100%. So in particular, what we're really excited about is retroactive public goods funding. This is our first and our biggest public good funding mechanism that I was alluding to. And that is absolutely done by the Citizens House. Yes, so 100%.
And do you guys also have grants for projects that are in the ideation phase?
Yeah, the Optimism grants community is incredibly active. Huge shout out to the Grants Council, which is actually part of the Token House that runs an incredibly tight ship, processes hundreds and hundreds of applications per season, and gives folks the ability to go and bootstrap new ideas and make contributions back to the ecosystem. Yeah, so there's a few of them. The Grants Council on the token side, the retroactive public goods funding on the Citizens House side. It's a lot of fun.
Value proposition for like the developers. We talked a little bit about the grants. There's retroactive ones. There is ones that are like in the ideation phase, but those are, just we're talking about the money portion of it. What would be other compelling reasons for like a developer to build on Optimism?
So from the beginning, we have known that scaling Ethereum means scaling the thing that people know as Ethereum today. And in particular, the core of what Ethereum is known as the Ethereum virtual machine. So one of the big things that we have done is really, really, really focus from an architectural perspective on preserving every component of the Ethereum virtual machine to make it effortless and seamless and equivalent to be able to deploy an application on Ethereum layer 1 versus on a chain within the super chain. So that is a super, super important value proposition to us. all of the tooling needs to work out of the box. Any auxiliary integrations that you as an application developer need should be able to work out of the box and should be supported. All of the wallet software should work the same, right? And obviously we want to build improvements on top of that, but we have to stand on top of the shoulders of giants, right? The Ethereum system, while it is true that it is limited and what we're doing is trying to push beyond those limitations, fundamentally is a heroic effort of a global contributor base building some incredible technology. So the other big value proposition for Optimism is extending the Ethereum development process, not starting from square one or reinventing the wheel, because it is extremely effective, it is extremely battle tested, and it is the standard.
So we talked earlier about the importance of abstracting the blockchain part of it, the technology, but realistically, current state, it is something that people pay attention to, and we have to meet people where they are. So for the end users, since it's something that's topical right now, what would you say is the value proposition for them using the Optimism blockchain?
Great question, right? And you're totally true. We are in a world of early adopters today, and it's 100% our goal to push those boundaries and move into the later stages of adoption. But where we are today is where we are today, 100%. There's a few components to this. I talked about the standardization, and honestly, where I go with this answer is the same darn thing. There's a very strong value in at least standardizing the user experience across these different applications and these different chains, right? Imagine, to draw back to our AOL analogy, right? Imagine if every time that you were going to a different website, you had to learn a new way to log into AOL or a new way to connect to the modem, right? So one of the important things is just simply the notion of standardization, right? Even in a world where you are kind of more explicitly acknowledging one chain being bridged to the other and so on and so forth, there's a value in those two chains kind of being the same substrate, being on the same standard and giving you the same consistent experience. It means that things like wallet UX, like you have one consistent way to understand the things that you are signing, as opposed to going to different networks and trying to understand the idiosyncrasies or the differences or the challenges between them. And then obviously the other thing that you get with that is, again, the auxiliary suite of an ecosystem, right? So once you have one chain that is integrated things like block explorers and wallets and analytics platforms, the same exact thing can be applied to a new chain in the click of a button. And that is super powerful. It is one thing that we are in a transitionary moment in as an industry is the fact that not just from an application developer perspective, we're shifting from a world of one chain to a world of many chains, but also all of the supporting infrastructure that comes with it. And that is quite candidly a huge challenge because those people were already doing God's work, just doing all of these value propositions and these features and applications for a single chain. And going into a world with multiple chains, right, you have a whole new suite of challenges. So at the end of the day, one of the critical key components from our perspective to make that all work and to make that journey feasible is standardization. We have to have an environment where spinning up new applications, new chains are consistent with the other ones. And it should be the click of a button. It should be the wave of a magic wand. It should be a single command in the terminal that allows you to take all of the incredible value that we see in the existing chains and bring that value into a new chain, right? So that is the power of the ecosystem, right? It is very, very important to us that everybody that is building on Optimism, be that a chain or an application on one of these chains, has best-in-class experience, best-in-class support, and that is consistent across the board so that everyone can take advantage of the incredible benefits that, albeit granted, we are still early in, but are significant in terms of the Ethereum scaling story, right? There's no question that Ethereum 5 years ago versus today, while not perfect, while still having fees, is night and day to where it was. I can't tell you my early days of doing Ethereum development and building applications and the version of Web3.js that I had to run or whatever was constantly changing and things were constantly breaking. These things have all improved massively over the last 5 years. And what we can't do in our journey to scale is regress on all of that supporting tooling. Because the reality is the incredible applications that we see on blockchains today, albeit they will get better, but even their existing state today is so much better than where we were. And we have to continue that momentum as an industry.
I'm going to go back to actually something that we talked a little bit about earlier. Base, for example, has been very aggressive in terms of outreach, development, getting people onboarded. They're backed by a massive company, Coinbase. Uh, let's say if I'm a developer and I want to develop on Base, what kind of support, if any, would I be receiving from Optimism?
We put out a great blog post on this recently. Shout out to Mirror, because we also use Mirror, and I didn't get a chance to express my appreciation for using a Web3 native blogging platform. We put out a post on our stance on this earlier, but ultimately, the goal of the superchain and the goal of expanding beyond one chain to many chains is that it is a fundamentally positive sum action to take, right? Fundamentally, what we are all going to do is scale better together by all sharing standards and leveraging all of the integrations and tooling and everything that I was just talking about. What we are ultimately participating in is an extremely positive sum outcome. Working in silos is not going to be as effective as working together as a whole. So the answer from the Optimism perspective is you'll get the same support wherever you go. Our goal is to give developers and end users the best possible experience to meet their needs. And it is absolutely incredible what projects like Coinbase and Zora are doing to further those in the more targeted ways that they're going for. So from our perspective, that is the most important thing. And where you're deploying is ultimately up to you. If that's within the superchain, we're going to support you, period, full stop. An example of this is we just ran an art campaign called We Heart the Art. And that included, that was basically like a creator competition to come up with dope on-chain art. That was absolutely amazing. And we said, we do not care where you deploy it. Deploy it on Base, deploy it on Zora, deploy it on OP Mainnet. It doesn't matter. The important thing is that you deploy it and we push the industry forward. Because any short-term gains of that being in one place or the other are massively, disproportionately outpaced by the positive sum nature of us all working together collaboratively. So that's the goal. That's the goal. If you're collaborating, we're here to support. That's all that it comes down to.
Yeah, so what I'm hearing really is just like public good. That seems to be a recurring theme, and trying to just push the space forward. And if we do that, then everybody wins, whether you're a developer, an end user, whatever stakeholder, wherever you are.
Exactly.
Everyone's going to win that way.
You know, I think that it can be very easy in the industry, because we have come so far, to look at the state of the industry today and think of that as the market. The reality is the industry today and the market today is not the industry and the market of 10 years from now. It is going to grow orders and orders of magnitude beyond where we are today. And it is critical as we do that to focus on that outcome. It's very easy to be short-sighted and look at the market movements and the adoption today and think of that, because it is so exciting and we should be extremely proud of that as an industry. But we can't lose sight of the fact that we are, orders of magnitude away from where the end game is. And the reality is that means that we all need to work together towards those outcomes. And infighting over the market today makes zero sense, because we are so far from that market being where we need to end up. So yeah, I couldn't agree more. This is a decades long journey that we are taking together as an industry. And we have to go about it with that mindset. If we go about it with thinking about short-term wins, the industry is going to stall and we're not going to accomplish our goals.
Yeah, 100%. I think with my fellow podcasters, we feel the same way. Sometimes there's this notion on the outside that we're like in competition with each other. We're like the Conan O'Briens and the Jay Lenos, but it's actually not the case at all. We're kind of see ourselves as more of a cohort, and we're supportive of each other, because realistically, we're so early in this game that it kind of just doesn't matter. We just want to move the space forward. We all want to mutually just amplify people that are doing interesting things, and who's doing that isn't really materially important. It's going to bode well for all of us to do that and be aligned on that, as opposed 100%. To try to, figure out all right, you talk to this guest, talk that guest, or, any of that stuff. So, and in the same vein, I'm building a podcast player as well that I've talked a little bit about on this podcast. And there's other people doing the same thing. It's a Web3 podcast player, Web3 powered podcast player, I should say. But I'm not the only one doing that. And in the same vein, when I'm talking to other people that are doing similar and we're sharing notes and we're exchanging notes and we're not doing it at the mindset of like, oh, don't do this, or, you know, this is competitive. And it kind of technically is competitive, but we really don't care. We just want to build a podcast player that solves problems. And I can go on about this, almost like share my pitch deck, that there are problems, you know, in the podcasting industry because it's largely relying on a Web 1 technology from 1999. And we're just trying to set out and solve those things and fast forward things to 2024 here. And how we do that, who's doing that, not materially important. We just kind of want to get shit done. So elephant in the room, there are other L2s out there. There's Arbitrum, there's side chains like Polygon. How's Optimism different?
Ultimately, I think what we need to acknowledge as an industry is that we are all working towards the same goals. I'm going to rant on this podcast a lot about positive sum things because positive sum outcomes are what we need to drive towards as an industry. So I don't know, there are differences between all sorts of protocols and different nuances and approaches being taken. At the end of the day, we're all here to scale Ethereum, and that positive sum outcome is critical. From our perspective, the only really most critical thing that we do is we solve the sustainability problem in blockchains. The reality is that, I mentioned this before, we are standing on the shoulders of giants just in scaling Ethereum, and almost every project in the ecosystem, at least in the Ethereum ecosystem, is scaling the Ethereum virtual machine, which I mentioned before, which is sort of the standard application development framework that so much tooling and so much power has been built around over years and years and years of development. So for us, the only important thing is that we fix the incentives for building that and continuing that journey, because we are not going to do it alone. It is going to be decades and decades of many, many, many people on a global scale contributing to so many aspects of the stack. And what we need to do is reward the people that are creating those technologies and that are building those things, because there is a fundamental gap if you look at the market today. The reality is that open source is an incredibly powerful tool, but it comes with serious challenges. Those serious challenges are that very often open source contributors are not rewarded. They're like oftentimes moonlighting while working for one of the giant Web2 companies that we're all trying to displace here, right? And that trend is not a sustainable trend. And if we want to make crypto a global industry where the infrastructure is globally accessible, we need to have better incentive mechanisms so that people can write open source code and give it away as their full-time job. Full stop. That needs to be the outcome that we drive towards. And so I think maybe we emphasize that a little more than others, but ultimately that is the important thing that matters. And I actually think that in the coming years, what we will see is much more overlap between these ecosystems. And to us, the most important thing is that the contributions that we share between those ecosystems are rewarded. That is the critical component. So, you know, maybe it's a cop-out answer, but ultimately we're not at a point in the industry where we're trying to divvy up some pie that is the end game and is big. We should be proud of the size of the pie that we have today. But at the end of the day, it's a tiny slice of the pie factory that we're all working towards. And as long as the folks that are creating the open source software are properly rewarded for doing that, we don't care. We just have to make the technology scale and bring it to the masses.
So yeah, it just kind of brings it back to it's at this point, it's too early to talk about like competition or competitiveness. The space is just so vast and there's so much void that needs to be filled that it really materially doesn't matter in terms of
and I think the other
who's getting there.
Exactly. And I think even beyond that, I think the question is still open as to whether even that end game has the same definition of competition that we see today. You alluded to like the early internet, and one of the fascinating parts of the early history of the internet, I think, is that many of the principles and goals that we talk about in Web3 as critical and replacing things in Web2 that went wrong, even as far as early back as Web 1.0, the technologists had a vision, had a belief that that was where the technology was headed. And the reality is that market forces and competition captured the current version of the web because of those incentives. And some of those incentives do come down to competition, right? It's things like who has the best economy of scale to run giant servers in the cloud. Turns out that when you have that economy of scale, you own all the data in your giant siloed warehouse in the middle of the desert, right? These are big problems that we need to solve. And so, yes, we are too early to talk about competition. I also think that when we start talking about things that sound like competition in the future, it probably and hopefully will have a different vibe than the extractive nature that we see today. Because the internet started as a decentralized technology. Fundamentally, the protocols of the internet are decentralized, but the market's incentives that appeared on top re-centralized on the decentralized architecture. And that's something that we cannot repeat, or Web3 will fail. And if I think that if we are so close-minded as to not look at the fact that so many of the promises that we make in Web3 are very similar to the promises that the early internet folks were making, but it failed not because the technology was wrong, but because the incentives on top were wrong. That is the real failure mode. So anyway, yeah. So like agree, but also I think that we need to change what competition means, or we risk doing the same thing to Web3 that happened to Web2. And there's going to have to be a Web4 where people are trying to reinvent the wheel once again.
That's an interesting point. So we've talked a lot about L2s and how they're going to play a big role in the future. In terms of like direct transactions on L1s, what does your crystal ball think that's going to look like, if it's even going to exist at all? And then also kind of an additional question on that. I mean, do you see a future where, you've got like Ethereum and Solana and say Tezos are like major L1s out there, that there's some sort of maybe like super chain not overseeing, but kind of like helping facilitate transactions amongst those L1s? Or what are your thoughts around that?
Yeah, very good and very deep question. This is something that we spend a lot of time thinking about. Ultimately, I think the most important thing to say is that we will see the emergence of a spectrum of trade-offs. So we are trying to maximize decentralization and security when we are building these protocols. The reality is that as we continue to grow adoption, we will move beyond the product requirements that we see today for the high security environments. Ultimately, what I'm saying there is that it will come down to trade-offs. And it is going to be the case that a decentralized game is not going to need the same security profile as a multi-billion-dollar trade that occurs on layer 1 today, or maybe occurs on layer 2s in the future. So what it ultimately will boil down to is giving the ability for applications to match the security and cost trade-offs that their application requires, that their use case requires, right? So, to talk in more concrete terms, what does that mean? Layer 1s, layer 2s, layer 3s. Ultimately, those things are all going to serve different niches. And this is actually very similar to what you see in Web 2. There are servers that I can rent out for a side project where I don't really care about the uptime, and I don't think that somebody's going to denial of service attack, my online cooking, shopping list that I decided to put on my server. At the same time, I can go to a big cloud provider and buy an extremely secured lockdown instance that comes with a bunch of Cloudflare to prevent DDoS and so on and so forth, and more strict sign-on policies for going in and talking to the box. And I'll probably be charged more for that. And that is probably going to continue. It's ultimately going to be about matching the use cases to what they need.
That's probably like the best answer I've ever heard to that question. That makes so much sense when I kind of contextualize and you're talking about it, and I'm kind of working it out in my head, is that at the end of the day, it's really like what the end user experience needs to be like. And for, in some cases, like you said, a server doesn't need all the bells and whistles, rent it out, relatively nominal fee. Then maybe on the other side of the spectrum, you've got like an AWS type server, like you said, Cloudflare, and a whole bunch of different protection mechanisms, which costs a lot more, higher transaction fees, but you have that added security set. And at the end of the day, the user doesn't I don't know which websites are hosted where. It kind of doesn't matter. I'm just going on these websites. I have some sense sometimes when I'm going to a website, like how secure it is, but who the provider is, it doesn't really, I wouldn't be able to tell you. So
100%.
Yeah, man, that's actually one of the best answers I've heard to that question. So
let me take it a one level further, right? Here's the even crazier thing. Putting aside all of these decentralization, blockchain components to this, fundamentally, one of the superpowers of the EVM and of standards and of our technology is that moving between those environments is going to become vastly easier than what that state of affairs is today, right? Today, if I went and I bought rented a small server that was for personal use, and I implemented a game, let's say I implemented Flappy Bird, right? And suddenly Flappy Bird goes viral on Reddit or Twitter or whatever, and starts getting a bunch of users. That server is going to go down. And my story for going to the sort of more production ready environment with the higher uptime and the higher guarantees, that comes alongside with a deep, complex migration path where I'm fundamentally going to have to go and re-architect Flappy Bird in such a way that now I have Kubernetes clusters and blah, 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 right? All of these technical details. And it's an absolute nightmare. And how often do I go on the front page of Reddit and I see some website that got got the quote unquote Reddit hug of death. And the person's like, sorry, I would need 2 weeks to go and get this deployed somewhere else. Like, bookmark this page and maybe come back when it stopped being so viral. One of the superpowers of crypto, even beyond anything to do with the security and the decentralization, is the power of application portability. So not only will it be the case that you will be able to deploy an application in a lower security environment or a higher security environment, because everything is standardized and everything is portable and all the data is open, it will be so much easier when your application goes viral and your requirements change to migrate that application to a higher security environment. I think this is like an very slept on superpower that has almost nothing to do with the normal value propositions that you hear about crypto, which have to do with the decentralization and the ledger and so on and so forth. And those things are all super important and ultimately why we're here. But literally just the ability to move applications between these environments in a much more portable, standardized manner, I think eventually will just make the development experience on blockchains straight up better than they are in Web 2, even putting aside any of those other requirements around decentralization and security and so on and so forth. So I'm very, very excited for that.
So would an example of that be perhaps, because it seems to me, at least with Ethereum L2s, you're getting the benefits of security, but not necessarily like the higher transaction costs and some of the downsides that come with that. And so when you're talking about portability, would something like that maybe look like you built something on one of, let's say like Base, I'm going to keep using that as an example, but let's say that for maybe branding reasons, not necessarily anything that's wrong with Base, but you just want to have like your own chain, like sort of like a Zora or something. I'm not saying they started off on Base, but you just kind of want to have it for branding reasons. When you're talking about portability, is that something that's relatively easy to implement on Optimism? Maybe you could get started on a Base, or maybe even just get started on Optimism and then just decide at one point that, hey, I kind of just want to brand it with my own thing. Is that like is that an applicable example of that portability piece?
Yeah, that's a great example. Definitely, I think what we will see will be a pattern that emerges where application developers deploy on an existing chain because the overhead for that today is much easier, is much lower. And then once that application goes viral, those folks are going to say, hey, we need our own state space. And we're going to click a migration button and be able to move that into their own chain. The other example that I would give is something like increasing the security of your application. For example, with ZK proofs, right? So ZK proofs are this like magic, wondrous technology that we hear about all the time. The reality is that generating ZK proofs are a computationally expensive action to take. And so we may also see applications that launch in low security environments and then add things like ZK proofs or longer dispute windows and so on and so forth as the value of that application becomes more important and you have to like adapt to that adversarial environment. So yeah, both of those examples, creating your own state spaces and also upgrading your state space as it gets more adoption and the stakes become higher and you want it to be more secure.
And when you're kind of doing that upgrade, I mean, it's increasing the costs, and I know it might be a little bit hard to speak to specifics, but when you're talking about costs, you're not necessarily talking about like Ethereum type costs, I'm assuming, in terms of like, okay, you're paying like $10 for some sort of transaction. I'm assuming you mean it's kind of like a fraction of a penny to a little bit higher of a fraction type of a thing. Or what does that look like? Yeah,
that's right. Yeah, exactly. And this is one of the grand sort of one of the grand journeys or like the grand adventures that we are embarking on with scalability is the goal for a project like Optimism trying to build out security, right? is to squeeze the most security and the most decentralization for the least cost. But at the end of the day, in the steady state environment, there still will be trade-offs there. And so, yes, you're right. Our goal is more, I mean, I would push farther and say our goal is to get from 1/100 of a cent for really for the initial application. And then when it grows big, it becomes 1/10 of a cent or whatever. Right. But yeah, that's exactly the right intuition. And I mean, what I'm talking about there.
Ben, thank you so much for appearing on the Blockchain Experience. I think L2s are going to play a massive role in the widespread adoption of blockchain technology, the way that we just talked about. And I definitely see Optimism playing a massive role in that. So I appreciate you spending the time with me and my listeners and giving the lowdown on why and whether you're a developer or an end user, you should be paying attention to what Optimism is doing. So again, appreciate your time, man.
Thanks for having me on, David. And thanks to all those who stuck around to the end for listening. Really appreciate listening to my insane philosophical rambles, my overly optimistic attitude. It's very much appreciated.
No, it's very much on brand, actually. And I love your energy and it's feeding off me. So I think this is going to be one of those podcast recordings where we're both very animated and we're both, I know you guys can't see, but we both have our morning coffee that we're
and my cup literally says always half full on it right here. Yeah, I know folks can't see this either. But I chose this for the podcast in case it wasn't video.
Always optimistic.
You know it.
So as you can see, the way that we ended the episode, I think we're both excited and super passionate about the role that L2s will play. And that is something that you certainly can't underestimate. My hope is we can have Ben on from time to time to give us updates on cool stuff that Optimism is doing. So now an update on Scoop 3. For those of you who are new, Scoop 3 is a next generation podcast player that Media 3 Labs, the parent company to the podcast, has been working on. Last week, at least at the time of this recording, it's last week, on February 1st, I gave a product presentation in the form of a webinar on what Scoop 3 is like, what we aim to do, and even broadly speaking, Media 3 Labs as a parent company, its mission, its values, its vision. And I've included the link to that in the show notes. I'll also encourage everyone who is listening to strongly consider investing in Scoop 3. I'll also include a link to that in the show notes. At the risk of sounding like a broken record, I do want to emphasize that it is truly an investment, the same way that like angel investors and VCs participate in. You're getting future equity in the parent company, Media 3 Labs. So it's truly like an exchange and not a one-way value extraction from us. It's something that, I've been adamant about since day one. It's something that we do not do. At Scoop 3, Media 3 Labs, the Blockchain Experience. So the minimum amount is only $100 for investment, and you do not have to be an accredited investor. So it's pretty amazing that we've been able to do that thanks to WeFunder, who worked with us on processing the legalities and the financial process and working with the SEC to make that opportunity available to everyone and not just an accredited investor. Also, a question that I do get from time to time is, do I have to be in the U.S. to invest? And the answer to that is no, you do not. We have investors from Canada, Sweden, Saudi Arabia. So hopefully you'll join our investment group and not only just be like a user of Scoop 3 or a listener of the Blockchain Experience, but take advantage of the opportunity to become a potential owner of Media 3 Labs, the parent company of both. So anyways, thanks for your consideration. Thanks for listening to the Blockchain Experience. And until next time.
Welcome to the Blockchain Experience. Bringing dope content to the audience. Welcome to the Blockchain Experience. Bringing dope content to the audience. It's the Blockchain spell made of David's got so much to tell. Bringing you the latest news without fail. Hey, decentralized and secure. It's been making waves. Can't tamper with data. It's not the same old way. From finance to art, it's bringing all the trust. The Blockchain Experience, it's a must. Hey, welcome to the Blockchain Experience. Bringing dope content to blockchain experience. It's a movement. Give it up, give it up, give it up, give it up, give it up for the blockchain experience. It's a game changer. It's a game changer. Welcome to the blockchain experience. Bringing dope content to the audience. Welcome to the blockchain experience. Bringing dope content to the audience. It's a blockchain experience. It's a blockchain experience. It's a blockchain experience. Give it up, give it up, give it up for Major David. Give it up, give it up, give it up for Major David. Give it up, give it up, give it up for Major David. Give it up, give it up, give it up for Major David. Welcome to the blockchain experience. Bringing dope content to the audience. Welcome to the blockchain experience. Bringing dope content to the audience. Welcome to the blockchain experience. Bringing dope